If you've been on the internet at all in the past year, you're probably familiar with the term tradwife. It's this popular lifestyle trend you'll see on TikTok or Instagram Reels, and it consists of women who got married and had children at a young age, and now have created this distinct aesthetic out of their traditional lifestyle. They'll do things like make butter from scratch or knit their own clothes as some kind of throwback to a better past when men were drunk and women were quiet. The general idea is that this is how things were for most of human history and people were happy with it, and it's kind of a rejection of more recent social changes and an exhibition of how cool it is to turn back the clock and act like you're a housewife from a bygone era. But was this really how women used to live? Did a woman in, say, the Middle Ages spend her entire day trying to make sure the roast was cooked properly so her husband would be satisfied when he came home from a long day at work? The simple answer is no. The tradwife trend is an idealization of a past that never existed. If you were to get in a time machine back to medieval Europe, you might be surprised to find that there were no tradwives who were chained to the stove all day while their husbands went out to earn a living. One thing I want to note before we begin is that I'm not trying to start a gender war here or claim that women used to have it better back in the Middle Ages. We obviously know that isn't true. I'm simply pointing out that this idea of a traditional wife and a traditional role for women in the home isn't really based in the historical tradition that you think it is. And I know all of this information I'm throwing out is probably blowing your mind right now and destroying this concept of tradition that has been so carefully built up by your online media consumption, so let's just dive right into the details. Now, you've probably seen commercials from the 1950s, or at least the modern parodies, where the husband rushes off to work and he gives his wife a quick peck on the cheek on his way out the door, and then she sits at home for the rest of the day to cook and clean and raise the kids. This vision of domestic bliss might have been somewhat legitimate in the 50s, but it really only became the norm in industrialized, urbanized, post-Enlightenment societies, and even then it was really only ever a thing with the middle and upper classes. Medieval society was built around household economies, not individual careers. The entire household worked together, and one of the biggest benefits of having children was that once they were old enough, they could help you out with whatever your work consisted of. So let's think about it for a second. Imagine a medieval serf, tied to his lord's land, spending his life sowing and reaping and sowing and reaping and doing his best to survive. Of course, his wife wasn't stuck in the house all day making complicated recipes from scratch and tending to kids who were already old enough to be potty trained. The whole family would be involved in the farming. The man might be the one plowing, but his wife would be sorting supplies or fixing equipment, and his children would be using their tiny little hands to help out wherever possible. And I'm not just making this up, there's an abundance of evidence to support the fact that men and women worked together, instead of the man working while the woman exclusively tended to the household. There are illustrations in the Luttrell Psalter, for example, which was published in England around 1330. The little pictures in the margins, which are meant to depict real life, show men and women working side by side at harvest time, with the men reaping while the women gather and bind sheaves. According to the British Library's official commentary on the Psalter, these farming scenes deliberately include both genders to showcase that during harvest time all available labor was required. Let's also take a look at the Domesday Book, that great survey of English life that was ordered by William the Conqueror not long after the Norman invasion in the 11th century. The book is chock full of references to women in all kinds of occupations within the feudal system, like brewers and bakers and dairymaids. In fact, women are engaged in all the same village industries as men, with the only exception being blacksmithing, simply because of the physical strength required to swing the hammer. Just like men, women combined regular household farming duties with contributions to the various medieval cottage industries, which would contribute to the manor's economic health. I can hear all the people in the comments already, but John, you're just talking about England. But John, just because something was recorded and written down somewhere doesn't mean it was true everywhere. But John, not everybody in the Middle Ages lived in rural villages. What about cities? What about other parts of Europe? Well, I'm about to smack you in the face with a veiny, pulsating truth tube. There are plenty of surviving medieval guild records, tax rolls, and city statutes that prove unequivocally that women, whether they were wives or widows or even independent artisans, participated actively in urban economies too. There's a book of trades which was compiled by the French provost Etienne Boileau in 1268 that documents the regulations of Parisian guilds, and out of the roughly 100 craft professions that are listed in Paris, 5 of them are headed by women, and in most of the other 95, women worked alongside men. For example, there was the Guild of Writing Tablet Makers, which allowed both male and female artisans as a matter of policy, and then there were also certain industries, a lot of which were in the textile and fashion sector, that tended to be dominated by women. Silk winding, ribbon making, linen embroidery, spinning, all of these are trades that are clearly listed as employing almost exclusively women in medieval Paris. So far I've mentioned wives working alongside their husbands in rural agricultural settings, and women working alongside men in more urban settings, but what about women striking out on their own? Did that ever happen in medieval society? You bet it did. Town charters and legal records refer to the femme sole, or single woman status in English law, which allowed an unmarried or widowed woman to trade and sue in court on her own. Versions of this existed elsewhere as well, like in the Italian city-states of Florence and Venice. It was pretty common for widows to take over the banking and trading ventures of their dead husbands. There was Donna Andrea di Narni of Trevi, for example, who in the 15th century took over her late husband's cloth business and is mentioned in notarial contracts from 1428 as a mercatrice, or a female merchant who operates independently. Now, I won't sit here and say this was a super common thing, but cases like Andrea's show that even outside of family enterprises, urban medieval women could have their own path towards economic agency. If we want to talk about what was the more common situation in urban contexts, it would be women contributing their labor or expertise in things like brewing, retail, crafts, or textile production within a family workshop with their husband and children, which made it a joint venture. We've already learned that women were active in the traditional medieval workforce, but what about religious life? It's important to remember the supremacy of Christianity not only when you're thinking about medieval religious observance, but also when you're trying to examine any aspect of medieval life. Monasticism was wildly popular in the High and Late Middle Ages, and it wasn't just men who participated. Medieval nuns ran and lived in their own convents, which also operated as estates, workshops, and houses of trade. Convents usually held extensive lands and feudal rights, like Malling Abbey in Kent, England, which was a Benedictine nunnery that was also a significant owner of land. The Royal Charter Rolls record from 1105 records that Henry I granted the Abbess of Malling and her convent the right to hold a weekly market every Saturday, a privilege that was reconfirmed later by Edward III in 1347. This might not seem that significant to us today, but the charter essentially made the abbess the lord of a local market town, and it even allowed the nuns to collect tolls and rents from the stallholders, which in turn generated income for the convent. Speaking of convents generating income, a lot of them did so through the manufacture of various goods, many of which were luxury items or the kinds of things that took a high level of skill to produce. Textile production was a big one for medieval nuns. In fact, they were widely renowned for their fantastic embroidery, weaving, and book production skills, which they would provide to patrons in exchange for donations. When they weren't producing these luxury items for the more well-to-do members of medieval society, nuns also usually sold off the surplus agricultural produce that they had gathered from their land, like butter or cheese or wool. There were even convents that had breweries and sold ale to thirsty pilgrims, and the nuns would do all of the brewing, serving, and bookkeeping for the always popular alehouse business. When you look at all these things together, you start to get a picture of a form of female financial independence that existed in the Middle Ages, where these nuns were engaging with local markets and craftsmen and essentially turning their convents into economic hubs that were entirely run by women. But we've said a lot here, so let's try and bring it all together and see if medieval women were really tradwives in the way that we understand this chronically online term. Sure, medieval women baked bread, and they did cook recipes from scratch, and they raised children and performed domestic tasks. Nobody is arguing this, least of all me. What I am arguing, and I've tried to show evidence for with this video, is that the idea of a tradwife that is being sold to you on your TikTok feed is actually purely a fabrication, a vague throwback to an era that you weren't alive for and which you are looking at with rose-tinted glasses. Medieval women worked with their husbands and treated their households as a cohesive economic unit, not a place for them to clean while their husbands were away at work. Work was local in the Middle Ages, and unless your husband was off fighting in some armed conflict in a faraway land, you would spend your entire day and entire life together under one roof doing the same kind of work and raising your family together. But what do you think of the tradwife trend? Is it something that should be promoted on social media, or is it based on a fundamental misunderstanding of history? I'm John, and this has been Medieval Mindset. Be sure to like and subscribe, and tune in next time for more of my long-winded rants on medieval history.